Hello, I am Theresa Stack, an associate professor at Montana Tech, and I will be discussing today the biomechanics of work or the biomechanics of the human body. Primarily, we'll talk about Newton mechanics and how the body can be described as a series of levers and springs so that you can understand different loading or muscular effort that is required to hold a posture or perform a lift. And this goes along with Chapter 7 in the text Occupational Ergonomics, a Practical Approach. So the main objectives for this unit are to review the basic principles behind levers as they apply to the human body. Primarily, this supports lifting analysis tools and loading on the spine, but it can be used for any joint, of course. And then I think what the most important thing that you can get out of this unit would be to recognize the limitations and the advantages that the spine and other joints have in relation to posture and strength. So really to understand how the neutral posture is the best posture for speed strength, endurance because of muscular activity and response, and that even small changes in posture can reduce forces and really help people be able to perform their job with a lower likelihood of being injured. So biomechanics is one of my favorite personal topics and I've done a lot of work with the Navy in the area of biomechanical loading on the body. But what biomechanics is, or how we're describing it here in this learning unit, is biology has to do with life or living organisms. And mechanics is a branch of physics concerned with the analysis of actions or forces as they relate to materials or systems. So here as they relate to the human body. So biomechanics is the study of forces and their effects on living systems. So every task that we do, whether we're sitting statically, we're doing a bench press, or we're running down the basketball court, can be described in terms of specific movements and forces generated. The goal of occupational biomechanics is to qualitatively describe the degree of postural stress to prevent injury. Modeling programs can be done to perform this analysis, as well as to recognize that different tools have been developed based on these modeling programs to evaluate postural stress. So whether you're using Ruler or Reba, a manual materials handling guide by Liberty Mutual, in part the NIOSH lifting equation used postural analysis, or the ACJH-TLV for lifting, these tools have been integrated to some degree, some more than others. The first models were based on work by Chaffin. Occupational biomechanics is definitely a classic text in the area of ergonomics. And this is what the first models looked like. And you can see that although we're looking at, when we're doing this basic biomechanics here for this lecture, we're going to look at loading on one joint, on the elbow or on the spine. But that all the other body parts come into play when you're doing biomechanical analysis. And so this is called a free body diagram, and it's used to calculate the forces or moments around the joint. And by looking at this, you can see how this ties into anthropometry. So when you're able to model the human body, a taller person with very long limbs, long muscle units, could have different postural loading than a shorter person with really dense or thick muscle units. So anthropometry plays a big role in modeling, or how we look at the human body, or even just the biomechanics around the way the human body responds to forces. So this is an example of when I was in school, we would do all the calculations by hand, and then we'd check them on the computer to cross-validate different types of modeling programs. So this was in the beginning of modeling programs. This is some of the work I did with Dr. Weicker. And another example of the biomechanical modeling by Chaffin that has then been applied to different types of prediction models. So you can predict how much force would be on the human body given a posture, and you don't have to use more invasive methods to measure muscular activity or muscular effort. So I'm going to do a little brief example here of where biomechanical modeling was used. And in 2010, Dr. Weicker and I did a study of some U.S. Marines, and they were firing the M198, which is the 155 millimeter howitzer, fires a 155 millimeter shell. And we did both a psychophysical and a biomechanical analysis of this task. And so I was going to share this work with you so you can see how it can be applied. It can be applied to any type of job, although this was a military job. And we were able to get some publications out of this paper. Dan Ottenreith helped with the first publication on the psychophysical analysis. So what you're watching here is the task that we evaluated. This is a live fire exercise in a school in Quantico, Virginia, where lieutenants are being graduated, so they're checking out of their basic school, and they are calling in coordinates to these other Marines who then have to follow the orders and shoot off the coordinates. So the lieutenants are being tested, but it's a live fire simulated exercise. And so the methods that we employed is we observed the folks on their days in which they set up the guns. It took them one day to set up the guns and bring all the ammunition in. Then we conducted some interviews, and then we observed them for day 2 and 3. We watched the entire live fire exercise, and then we conducted some post interviews. So you can see the cycle here and the different tasks that we were evaluating. So we evaluated both psychophysical evaluations, so that's feelings of fatigue and exertion, as well as I did some biomechanical modeling of different subtasks that are done within this entire process here of shooting off rounds. So as you can see, it was extraordinarily large. The round is placed on the loading tray when there's a call for order fire. Somebody is writing down the coordinates and moving the gun. These people are in the background, and then they verify that. The powder man puts the powder in that has to do with how far the gun will shoot out and the type of round that is being put in the chamber. The round is verified to make sure that the round head is tightly on there and it's the right kind of round head. Then the gun is loaded. They shut the breech, they put a fuse in, and then they pull the trigger. And so this task was done repeatedly for 2 days. They shot approximately 500 rounds per gun per day. There were 3 guns. And what else we found out was, as you can see, these 3 people at the end who are doing really most of the manual labor, moving the round, putting it on the loading tray, and then picking up the loading tray and bringing it to the back of the gun, and then, of course, the rammer who rams it up into the gun. They did most of the manual labor because they were short on folks, as in many folks were on limited duty. The optimal crew size of 9 wasn't being utilized. They were only using a crew size of 6, so people didn't rotate tasks. We surveyed the crew. We went around about every 7 to 12 minutes and surveyed the crew. We asked them their feelings of fatigue, pain, and exertion. We did this on an anchored scale. That's the study of psychophysics. There is a chapter in the book. It's one way where you create surveys where people can cross-modal match, so they can match a term or a feeling together. So the feeling of pain or exertion on a number scale, and they can match that to how they feel throughout the day. When you baseline somebody with something like 0 is no pain or discomfort, and 10 is the maximum amount you can't even withstand anymore. So you can see that the feelings of pain were low, as well as fatigue in the morning when we started out. They climbed throughout the day. And then this is interesting finding, I believe, that fatigue reduced. The feeling of fatigue, you were able to reduce that when people rested at lunch. And pain didn't increase when folks rested at lunch. It did remain flat, but you didn't have any increase in pain. And so then when we resumed again after lunch, you can see that both fatigue and pain track together. So this shows the benefits of a work-rest cycle where you can bring down those levels of fatigue by implementing a work-rest cycle throughout the day. Although they did climb rather steeply there again. And then when we look at exertion, exertion was rated on a different scale. Exertion is more closely matched to your heart rate. And this isn't really the place where I would describe that, but the text has a really good example of the Borg scales, and this is what we used. You can again see that exertion, when we take a look at exertion, pain lagged behind exertion, so people were exerting themselves or they felt as though they were working harder and then they felt the pain. But it tracks pretty well with the feeling of fatigue. And again, the exertion levels, of course, they dropped off while people were at lunch or standing down. And maybe they should have dropped off a little bit more, but exertion is related to heart rate. So people still felt that even doing the stand down time because it was hot and they were moving rounds from the back up to the front and they were doing small tasks, that you still had those feelings of exertion. So those were the psychophysical findings. The biomechanical findings were really interesting. I modeled different tasks, but this is just the task of somebody assuming the posture where they were moving around from the pallet to the loading tray. We took anthropometric measurements, so I was able to plug in the averages in the biomechanical model so that I was modeling this particular demographic. And this is the type of postural analysis that's done. And these were some findings that came out. So it was really interesting about this. You can see that the compressive forces were 1,672 pounds of force on the lower back, and we use this force number, and that's plus or minus 124 pounds. So they were really great. The action limit, so this is based on the NIOSH lifting equation, action limit is 770 pounds. So they were near 3 times that. And if you go back and you see the task, and the postures they're in when they do this loading tray task, way low to the ground, the rounds are 96 pounds, you would guess that there was some high forces on the spine, but instead of guessing how high they were or using a postural evaluation tool where you take the angle measurements, we actually modeled it. What was surprising to us was the postural loading on the wrist. So only 23% of the population would be capable of repeatedly performing that task without developing a wrist injury, and also shoulder issues as well. The loading on the shoulder was pretty high. So if you go back and you take a look at what the loading tray looked like, the loading tray had these really straight bars on them. And then folks would pick them up and go to the back of the gun. And so when you take a closer look at the forces on the wrist, you can see that they had a severely deviated wrist angle, and that's what was causing the high forces on the wrist. And if we were able to somehow change the angle of the loading tray to look more like a preacher bar that you would use at the gym, changing the angle of the bar would then straighten out the wrist. The wrist would be in a more neutral posture when they're held that close together. So I didn't see this initially when I was watching the task. After we modeled the folks and we did this review of what we modeled, then we're able to see the problems with the wrist. And so we did recommend that to the Marines to be able to change the angle on the loading tray, as well as instruct folks to use the back and the front of the loading tray, like the angle of the handle part here, instead of holding on in the center. One of the other things that we made for recommendations back to the Marines, where you can see how the pallet here, you have the rounds that are being stored on the pallet. If they put the pallet on the ground, that raises the loading tray and reduces some of that torso flexion, and will actually reduce some of the forces on the lower back, although the rammer would then just have to walk around it. So we did make some recommendations, but I wanted you to see how we're quantitatively measuring the effort in the human body, or the responses of the human body, the muscular effort, and how it's related to different postures in which we put ourselves in. So I'm going to move forward and I'm going to talk about biomechanical modeling and the different lever systems in the human body, but don't get hung up on the math. All right, so we're going to discuss biomechanics as they relate to the human's body, and we use Newton's mechanics. These are the principles that we follow in physics. So we have four parts of our lever system. We have the fulcrum, which is the point of rotation. That's usually the center of a joint in the human body. You have a lever arm, so there are two lever arms that we discuss. One lever arm is the distance from the fulcrum to the muscle attachment. That's your effort or your resistance or the force generated by the musculoskeletal system. And then you have the lever arm for the load. And the load is the applied force. So if I was holding a weight in my hand, the muscle effort would be the contraction of my bicep muscle, and the um, force generated by the load would be a product of the weight of the object in my hand and the distance it is from that fulcrum. So you have a fulcrum, which is a point of rotation, and you have two lever arms. One of them is the load, or what is being applied to the human body, and the second one is the reactionary forces, or the effort. As we move or articulate around a joint, we describe this motion or calculate the forces applied to the human body using the basics of a lever system. The first class lever, we find that as described, where you have the load and the effort on opposite sides. In our body, this gives us the maximum range of motion. Just look at how much you can move your head. It's because of the joint, but it's also because of the lever system as well. The second class lever is found in the foot, and this one gives us the maximum strength. This is where our body has the biomechanical advantage. We don't have to exert as much force, as much effort as the load that's being applied to the body. So we're at a biomechanical advantage. And I'll show you some calculations so you can understand that in the next coming slides. And then the third class lever, the one that they use the example of the elbow joint, this is also found in the spine, where the point of rotation is your L5S1 vertebrae, and your muscle effort are your erector spinae muscles as well as your abdominal and your oblique muscles. And the load is, of course, whatever it is you're holding in your hand. In a third class lever, we have maximum speed. We can be really fast with our third class levers and fairly powerful, but our body is at a biomechanical disadvantage. It means we have to contract with far more force or effort or energy than is being applied to our body. So I am using these terms interchangeably, but I want you to understand the basics behind it so that the math will make sense. So we're using the word forces, but forces act on a single plane, like pulling back and forth. the body actually acts using rotational forces. And rotational forces are described as moments, but moments can be basically characterized as forces if you take that vector quality or that direction and the angle out of the equation. And that's why we're using the terms moments and forces interchangeably. But you have two forces that we're going to take a look at. One force is the load or the energy that's being applied to the human body, and the second force is the energy or effort or muscle contraction necessary to stabilize the spine. And so I'll do some demonstrations so that you can see this, and then we'll do some math as well. And then we'll understand, just some basic math so you can understand why posture is so important in the study of ergonomics. So force, just a basic equation here. Think about force as equaling weight times distance. I'm going to use the terms moments and forces interchangeably. Moment is used when we do our rotational calculations, which is the true way of doing it when we do biomechanics. But we're using a simple or a basic model here, and we're using the term force. Levers in the human body. And there are three different classes of lever systems. The first class, the second class, and the third class. What you see here is a representative of the first class lever. The fulcrum is the point in the middle, or the F, in which the lever rotates around. You have two lever arms. You have the distance from the fulcrum to the load in the body. You have the distance from the fulcrum to the effort in the human body. So in this first class lever, if we apply a 10-pound load and our body responds with 10 pounds of force, then the system is balanced. This is a first-class lever. Unfortunately, in the human body, we rarely see this arrangement. The only time we do is with the head, where the fulcrum is the point of rotation, right about where the occipital bone comes in contact with the C1 vertebrae. Your load is your chin, or the weight of your head, and your effort is the muscle contraction. As long as you keep your ears over your shoulders, this is a 1-to-1 ratio. So if my head weighs 15 pounds, my muscles will contract with 15 pounds of force to pull my head upright. This is what can be seen as a 1-to-1 ratio. We're going to talk about is the one we most oftenly find in the human body, and that's the third class lever. It's really easily represented if we look at our arm. The point of rotation is our elbow. The muscle attachment is our bicep, which is right here, and the load is the weight of the object in our hand. So you can see F is the point of rotation. The point of rotation from the muscle effort is small, a small lever arm, where the point of rotation to the load is big, a big lever arm. The bigger lever arm therefore has the mechanical advantage. When we look at our body, we can think of the fulcrum as the L5-S1 vertebrae. And the load out here is the weight of your object in your hand. So this person is going to pick up 20 pounds. Now the muscle attachment is where your erector spinae muscles come in contact with your spine. This lever arm is right here next to the fulcrum. So for me to pick up 20 pounds, how much muscle force do I have to contract with? Well, there's 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100. And this is a true representation of what goes on in your spine. 110, 20, 30, 40. So for me to pick up 20 pounds, my muscles have to contract with 140 pounds of force to be able to get my body to pick up that weight. That's because the distance from the fulcrum, your L5-S1 vertebrae, to your muscle attachment is short, where the distance from the fulcrum to the weight in your hand is long. So now you can easily see, if I can just bring the load closer to my body, then I can decrease the amount of muscle force required to move that load. The closer the load is to the L5-S1 vertebrae, the lower the force is on the spine. The further that load is away from the L5-S1 vertebrae, the higher the force is on the spine. This is our third class lever, as seen in the human body. We see it almost in all our different joints. Take a look at the elbow. This allows us to be powerful and fast. We've already seen the ratio, which is about a 12-to-1 ratio in the human body, meaning that your muscles have to contract with 12 pounds of force for every 1 pound that your body needs to pick up. So let's assume again that I have 10 pounds in my hands. My body needs to contract with 90 pounds to be able to pull that weight up. But if I'm bending forward, which means that my torso now contributes to the weight of the object in your hand, it would look something like this. So not only am I picking up the 10-pound weight, but I'm picking up the weight of my torso. So here we have 90 pounds, 100, 10, 20, 30, 40, 140 pounds. For me to pick up 10 pounds while I'm leaning forward and my torso is contributing to the weight of the load, my body has to contract with 140 pounds of force. Simply trying to get my ears over my shoulders removes this weight and therefore changes the ratio of the load and the fulcrum, or the effort and the fulcrum. Because remember, force is a multiplier. Force equals weight of the object times distance it is held from its fulcrum. The closer you could get that load to your body, the more upright your spine, the lower the amount of compressive forces on your spine. So after the videos, those were again for educational purposes, so you can see the relationship. Please don't get hung up on the math. But I'm going to again show you how much effort it really takes, or how much muscle force you need to generate when you're in different postures given the weight of an object. So to stabilize a joint, the applied moment causes when it bears down on you. So I'm holding a 40-pound weight. How much effort does my muscle have to respond to be able to stabilize it? Well, because that distance, or that lever arm from the fulcrum to the joint or to the muscle attachment, is small, your body has to generate a whole bunch more force than is being applied, or that is how much muscle force or internal force. So we're using these terms interchangeably, muscle moment and muscle force, just so you can understand the concepts. So how much effort to lift a 40-pound weight? So we have muscle moment. That's how much muscle effort, that has to equal the applied moment. So how much force is bearing down on us when we're holding that weight. Our equation is weight times distance. So we have a 40-pound object. It's held 12 inches from the fulcrum. So that's the distance from the bony protrusion on my elbow to the center of my hand. And when we do our math, we can see that that 40-pound weight is actually causing a 480 inch-pound moment. That's how much, that's the torque that's being applied by just that 40-pound weight, because it's not just the weight of the object, it's the distance that it's being held. So the question is, how much muscle force does our body have to respond with to hold that weight? So I take my answer and I just move it up to the top. My applied moment is 480 inch-pounds. And now I need to solve for the muscle moment. Well, we use the same exact equation. The weight the effort, and so this is actually our muscle force when we're thinking about moments, although I'm using the term weight, so it's easy for you to understand, multiplied by the distance. And so the distance here is the distance from the fulcrum to the muscle effort. And that distance is really small. That attachment from the bony protrusion of the elbow to where the bicep muscle comes in contact with the forearm is really small. It's 0.5. So let's do some substitution and then see how much muscle force is required to move that 480 pound, or to move that 40 pound weight that's in my hand, that's generating 480 pounds, inch-pounds of force. So I substituted my 0.5 inches into my equation, and now I'm going to solve for effort or muscle force. And so it takes 960 pounds of effort to be able to hold that 40-pound weight. So I'm just going to give you a minute to take a look at the equation. My 40-pound weight is held at 12 inches from the fulcrum, but my muscles have to generate 960 pounds of force to be able to just hold that 40-pound weight steady. So the load here, not the muscle, has the biomechanical advantage. And this is the third class lever, and this is the same lever system that we see in our spine. So if I took 40 pounds and I held it in my hands, and the 40-pound load was 20 inches from my body, my muscle force, my erector spinae, my abdomen muscles would have to generate 800 pounds of force to be able to hold that 40-pound weight. And that's because the multiplier that we're using here is 1. So it's easy to do the math when we're just taking our muscle moment and we're making it equal to our applied moment. So the distance to the L5S1 vertebrae is about 1, sometimes it's 2 inches given the girth of an individual, but we're biomechanically modeling it, so we're using 1, right? So I take that 40-pound load, I hold it 20 inches from my body, I have 800 pounds of force that my muscles have to contract to hold that. I move it in 15 inches from my body, now I only have 600 pounds of force that my muscles have to contract, and I move it all the way in, right up against my gut. I'm 10 inches from my body, and my muscles only have to contract with 400 pounds of force. As we saw from the example of the gunners, right around 770 pounds is the NIOSH action limit, and when we double that, around 1,500 pounds, that's the permissible exposure limit. That's where you'd be above the lifting index if you were using the NIOSH lifting equation. That's where spinal discs don't only bulge and deform, but they may crack. And where at the action limit you get some bulging and weakening, potentially micro cracks would occur. Now, this is a different lecture. The NIOSH lifting equation isn't just based on biomechanics, but I want you to understand the biomechanics behind it and why changing your posture changes the amount of muscle force required to do a task, and therefore you can increase or decrease the likelihood of injury by putting people at a biomechanical advantage or a biomechanical disadvantage. And this is just a really quick math lesson here, right? So we are a 200-pound male. I know this guy probably weighs more than that. And I'm leaning forward when I'm picking up that 400-pound weight. Well, the 200-pound person, about 60% of your body weight is from your hips to your head. And so we're going to say that 120 pounds, which is 60%, is contributing to the load that the person has to lift. So now I need to lift up the weight of my torso and pick up the 40 pounds, and I already have 1,520 pounds of muscle force required to move that 40-pound load. So posture plays a big role in just those small changes, bringing somebody a little bit more upright, changing their posture reduces the loading on the spine in all the different joints, because mostly we are representative of a third-class lever system. So here's your second class lever system, just to do some math again. I took my 200-pound person, and they have a size 12 foot, which means that where the load comes down and generates those downward forces is in the tibia, and that distance multiplier is about 8 inches. When I put the numbers in and I move them around and I solve for muscle effort, your 200-pound person puts 1,300 pounds of force is being loaded onto the foot. To be able to contract that calf muscle and get somebody up and moving, that person only has to contract with 162 pounds of effort. That's because the effort lever arm is further away from the fulcrum than the load, unlike the second class lever system. And so this is where we're at the biomechanical advantage. Our muscles have the advantage. We only have to contract just a little bit to be able to move a really large load. And so the head weighs about the weight of a bowling ball. If we had an 18-pound head and we say the fulcrum, so that's their ears, are over their shoulders, and that fulcrum is about centered. It's about 4 inches from where the occipital bone comes into contact with your C1 vertebrae. Then our muscles have to contract with 18 pounds to be able to hold our 18-pound head. Well, that's a 1-to-1 ratio. There again, we are not at a mechanical advantage or at a mechanical disadvantage. So lifting rules of thumb probably make a little bit more sense now. If the load is not close to your body, the pressure is gross. The further the load is held away, especially below the knees or above the shoulders because of other biomechanical properties when you change your posture, the pressure on your lower back is gross. It's big. It's huge. If the back is bent, you won't prevent. Well, that has to do with increasing that lever arm. If your muscles are slack, you'll hurt your back. We talk about this a little bit more in spinal work-related musculoskeletal disorders. But when you can do an abdominal contraction when you're lifting, that means you can contract your abdomen muscles and increase your interabdominal pressure. You're stabilizing your torso. It's like putting that belt on if you were lifting. You can increase that pressure and you're less likely to be injured because you're stabilizing your entire spine in both the front and the back, anterior and posterior. All those muscles are important in spinal stabilization. So hopefully you understand now that posture and load determine muscle loading, as well as what class of lever puts you at a biomechanical advantage and disadvantage. So by making those small changes in distance, improving people's posture, you can decrease the amount of force applied to the human body. And so loads lifted or carried, if we talk specifically about spinal biomechanics, when you're in the power zone, the lower the forces on the spine. I hope you have a wonderful day. Some yoga poses there for you to take a look at and see how we have that longer lever arm, arms up, legs out. We're using many more muscles than when we have the shorter lever arm, legs in, arms forward.